the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. Did you know that there's a deadly connection between animal abuse and domestic violence? It's called the violence link, and reporting an animal being mistreated could help save lives. During COVID-19, domestic violence numbers spiked to the point where we began to call it the shadow pandemic. Canadian domestic violence hotlines were ringing constantly, shelters were overwhelmed, and the police reported more than 12% increase in help calls related to domestic disturbances between March and June of 2020. Alongside that, data across North America has begun to reveal the violence link, that often cruelty towards the family pet is intertwined with other violence within the home. A recent survey by the University of Windsor revealed that 90% of women survivors of violence said that their pets had been mistreated by their partners too. And more than half said they delayed escape out of concern for their pet's safety. A lot who managed to make it to a shelter considered returning to the abusive partner because he had their pet. This is the reason some shelters and protective programs are making accommodations for pets, but there's still a long way to go. I'm joined today by Hannah Brown, manager of the Criminal Justice System Reform Program of Humane Canada, to explain the violence link and why a victim of violence shouldn't have to choose between their own personal safety and that of their much-loved pets. Hello, Hannah. Thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Great to be here.
Why don't we start with an overview of how do pets fit into the big picture? When we talk about domestic abuse or family abuse, we often tend to think of a vulnerable partner or a child. How do pets come into this?
Yeah, so as you know, Canadians really love their pets. They view them as family members. And given their shared vulnerabilities, the family pet might be a victim's only source of comfort. And unfortunately, this unique bond between the victims and their pets can be exploited by perpetrators. They use this bond to manipulate, control, and intimidate their partners and children, to be silent about their abuse, prevent them from leaving, and even force them to return. I give you an example. So if a perpetrator threatens to kill the family dog, if the victim reports the abuse or leaves, this can have a significant emotional effect on the victim to the point that they might change their behavior, willing to risk their own life to protect that of the pet.
And is that what the violence link is? A lot of people don't know about this term. Can you explain a little bit more and how it came about? I actually came to it through your website as well.
Sure. So the violence link is the connection between violence against animals and violence against humans. In other words, where there's violence between people, there's often animal abuse and vice versa. And not only that, the abuse is actually linked in the way I've just illustrated. And while in this context, we've been talking about violence linking the domestic violence sphere, in fact, animal abuse can be interlinked with many other types of offences, such as gang violence, youth crime, organised crime, homicide, sexual assault, and unfortunately, child abuse as well.
Right. So the pets, they can be intertwined in this in many ways. They can be a victim or they can be a tool in abusing a victim. And also they can be a lure to emotionally blackmail and bring a victim back into the relationship, right? We have such a unique bond with our pets.
That's definitely true. So studies here in Canada show how perpetrators use that really strong bond to harm and control their partners. And that will prolong exposure to violence by impacting the help-seeking behaviour and subsequent actions of the victims. So just some statistics which really illustrate the enormity of the issue. So nearly 75% of shelter staff reported being aware of abused women not accessing the shelter because they couldn't bring their pets with them. And over half of domestic abuse victims in one study delayed leaving their abusive partner due to concerns for their pet's safety. And a third even considered returning to the abusive partner because they'd had to leave their pets behind. And that's a really dangerous situation to be in.
And animal abuse and family violence I've seen so far is usually perceived and treated as a separate issue that up until recently has also been handled independently by animal control or human service agencies. How important is it for there to be a more holistic approach between animal welfare and the criminal justice system stakeholders? You talk about cross-reporting and training. How important is this to keep both animals and people safe?
It's so important. At the moment, we have sectors who are working in silos. So human services only deal with human services, animal services only deal with animal services. And that just is failing victims. Someone, for example, who's fleeing a situation of domestic violence needs the person who's providing them with support to understand how important it is to take into account their whole family. That's not just the children, but also their pets. In the same way they don't want to leave the children behind, they don't want to leave the vulnerable pets behind who they've seen have been abused. So it's really important that the agencies are talking together, they're cross-reporting, they're working together to find solutions that really work for the victims. But really, the problem is that we don't have those systems in place currently. Our legislation doesn't take into account the violence link. We have stakeholders that aren't aware of it. And then even when they are aware of it, the violence link, they don't have the resources to act.
Mm-hmm. And your organization has been doing some of that work to spread awareness, to create opportunities around this, right? Tell me more about the Canadian Violence Link Conference.
Yes, so the Canadian Violence Link Conference is held every other year. It's an initiative of the Canadian Violence Link Coalition, which forms part of the Criminal Justice System Reform Programme at Humane Canada. And what we do in the coalition is we bring together stakeholders from all different sectors across Canada whose work intersects with the violence link. And we bring them together so that they can work together, they can learn together, they can understand where each other is seeing the violence link in their work, and they can understand how they can tackle that by working together. The conference is a means of doing that on a very practical basis. It also raises awareness of the violence link among those frontline workers and those who are facing violence link situations on a daily basis. Other work of the coalition is an awareness campaign, which we're launching this fall, which is literally just raising awareness and making people aware of the tools that are available to help out.
We'll be right back. And is Humane Canada helping to train law enforcement and first responders on dealing with these situations as well?
Yes, so we are supporting police officers and animal welfare associations to train their staff and recruits on what the violence link is. So we have some amazing individuals across Canada who are really working so hard. They're aware of the issue. They can see the massive gap in the system, and they're doing their best to provide that kind of training. And we, as Humane Canada and the Canadian Violence Link Coalition, also support them in those endeavours.
And broadly speaking, what do you tell them to look out for when investigating a potential animal abuse or domestic violence report in the context that it might all be linked?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'm not necessarily an expert on animal or human behaviour, but for example, if a first responder attends a domestic violence call, they might notice the family dog cowers, flinches, tail between the legs. That might be suggestive of animal abuse. And to flip it round, if you have a vet examining an animal who shows signs of abuse, they might see one of the partners refusing to pay for care which the animal needs. And that might be a means of controlling the other partner, controlling them by their concern for the animal.
Or if there's an animal abuse report, for instance, then maybe to dig deeper to see if there could be more problems with violence against people in that situation potentially as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. To please look for signs that there might be child abuse or abuse between the partners or even sexual abuse.
That was actually going to be my next question as well, that for community members, how important is it to keep an eye out and report animal abuse? Because as statistics show, this is an early indicator, it can be an early indicator of domestic abuse as well. And many advocates call it the tip of the iceberg. So how important is it for community members to keep an eye out on animal abuse as well?
It's so important. Animal abuse in itself is morally wrong. It is a crime. But apart from the fact that it is a wrong in itself, there is such overwhelming evidence of the link between animal abuse and abuse between human beings. You know, it's an indicator of the potential for increasing violence and dangerousness against people. Here's a great quote for you from a case in 2004. The judge said that the protection of animals is part of our criminal law because a person's treatment of animals, like the treatment of children, the infirm, or other vulnerable parties, is viewed as a barometer of that person's treatment of people. So yes, if you see a case of animal abuse, please report it, because you are not only potentially saving that animal, but also the people around them.
What kind of supports are already in place for someone who would like to leave but are also concerned about their animals? And can community play a role as well to provide that support?
Yeah, sure. I mean, firstly, as a community, we need to be aware of what's going on behind closed doors. It's really important that people aren't concerned that reporting abuse is being nosy or anything like that. Oftentimes, people are dependent on others around them, people that they come into contact with. So the vet, the doctor, the school teacher, those are the ones that are there that can notice those signs. And yeah, it's really important that people are made aware and do something about it. In terms of the support systems that are in place, in the case of a victim fleeing domestic violence, we have three potential solutions. The best case scenario is that they find a shelter that accommodates pets. Those are unfortunately few and far between because it's really expensive for the shelters to adapt and they simply don't have the resources. The second option is for pet fostering in the community, and there are organisations across Canada that assist with that, such as Pause for Hope and Safe Pet Ontario, where the pet will be fostered out into the community. The third option is to adopt the animal out to a humane society, which is obviously not ideal, but that is another option.
I want to talk about the defenses for the animals themselves as well. What kind of laws are there in place in Canada to prevent cruelty to animals and pet abuse in Ontario, for example?
Yes, so broadly speaking, the way it works is we have at the federal level, we have the criminal code, which imposes penalties for animal cruelty. And then we also have the provincial legislation, which differs from one province to the next. In Ontario, we have the Provincial Animal Welfare Services Act, which imposes quasi-criminal offences for animal cruelty. The issue is that, unfortunately, very few animal cruelty cases are actually prosecuted in comparison to the number that are investigated. We estimate less than 10% of cases that would warrant prosecution are actually successfully prosecuted. And there are numerous examples of complete, almost embarrassing failure of enforcement, unfortunately, by the authorities.
Right. And you also mentioned that there are some shelters that might be able to make accommodations for pets, but there's a lot of resources and expenses involved in that. Has that trend started increasing a little bit more once there have been results that have been documented showing that this might allow victims to actually seek help or escape a dangerous situation sooner rather than later?
Yeah, I would say that as awareness is increasing, particularly among the gender-based violence sector, there have been definite efforts to try and make provision for pets within shelters. And there are websites where victims can go to verify whether or not a shelter will accommodate pets on site or at least make provision, for example, the pet fostering in the community. So yes, there's definitely better awareness and definitely efforts to try and address this concern. But unfortunately, there still are huge gaps in the system.
And there's this other aspect also. While pets can be used as a tool for manipulation and abuse towards victims, at the same time, having one's pet with you can help heal and overcome the trauma of abuse for many, right? Who have escaped or left a traumatic situation.
Yeah, like I said, there's that really strong bond between the victim or the survivor and their pet. And, that pet might be the only constant in that child's or partner's life. And so it's really important that they have the pet with them during that recovery process. That would be the best case scenario. As you say, animals can be therapy for people, and they're very important members of the family that need to be integrated into the process.
So, what comes next? What would you want to change going forward and make happen to offer more help for vulnerable people and their pets?
Okay, well, I have a shopping list here. So,
Top five.
top five. Look, we need appropriate legislation. Our legislation needs to understand the violence link and integrate it. So we have seen changes recently. There's some incredible parliamentarians out there who are pushing for change, but we need more integration. We need legislation such as coercive control, which understands that animals can also be victims. We need better education and awareness. So that's why the Canadian Violence Link Coalition is doing what it does. But we need, the resources to be able to really push that message out there so that people can make a difference. And then thirdly, we need the resources and programs to be put in place, such as cross-reporting. So There have been recommendations that there should be cross-reporting between human and animal services, but current research shows that Canada's way behind, especially when it comes to other jurisdictions such as the US that have far better systems in place. We need to support regional groups so that communities can come together and they can address the issue within their communities.
Right. Thank you so much for your insight, Hannah, and for shedding light on an issue that not many people have that depth of knowledge on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for your time.
I was speaking to Hannah Brown, manager of the Criminal Justice System Reform Program at Humane Canada. If you witness an act of animal cruelty or neglect, please call your local SPCA or Humane Society and speak to the Animal Cruelty Investigations Department. If there is no local SPCA or Humane Society where you live, call the provincial SPCA, the local police, or the RCMP. If you and your pet need help, we have also included a list of shelters with pet services in our show notes for this episode. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mudhar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.